The air in Dallas hung heavy with the acrid tang of smoke, a bitter reminder of the riot that had torn through the city just weeks ago, leaving scars on both its streets and its people. It had started with a single gunshot, a white cop, a black teenager, a protest that spiraled into chaos, with flames licking storefronts, shattered glass crunching underfoot, and chants of rage echoing into the night. In the upscale enclave of Peachtree Heights, where luxury car showrooms gleamed like beacons of wealth, the tension was a living thing, a low hum of suspicion that clung to every interaction, a city on edge waiting for the next spark. The residents, mostly white, mostly rich, had doubled their security, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. A word that too often meant anyone who didn't look like them, anyone whose skin carried the weight of history's judgment. It was into this charged atmosphere, on a humid afternoon in 2025, that Darius Mitchell, 30, drove his beat-up Toyota Corolla, the engine rattling like a tired old drum as he pulled into the parking lot of Elite Motors, a showroom renowned for its supercars, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and the Mclaren 720s he'd read about online, a machine that had captured his imagination with its sleek lines and raw power. Darius wasn't here to buy, not really. He just wanted to see the car up close, to feel the thrill of its presence, a momentary escape from the weight of a city still bleeding from its wounds. He stepped out of the Toyota, the door creaking on its hinges, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, his faded black t-shirt and jeans a stark contrast to the polished glass and chrome of the showroom. His dark eyes sparkled with boyish excitement, his short dreads catching the late afternoon sun as it filtered through the haze. But there was a cautious edge to his movements, a wariness honed by years of navigating spaces where he was often the only black face, where his presence was a question mark before he even opened his mouth. Darius was a software developer, a freelancer who'd built a quiet but successful career coding apps from his small apartment in East Dallas, a neighborhood where the streets buzzed with life, but also with the constant hum of survival. But he was also the son of Malcolm Mitchell, a billionaire tech mogul whose name graced skyscrapers and headlines, a titan of industry whose fortune had reshaped the landscape of Dallas and beyond. Darius kept that lineage hidden, preferring to live simply, to move through the world without the weight of his father's shadow, to be seen for who he was, not what he came from. Today, though, that shadow was far from his mind as he pushed open the showroom doors. The air conditioning hitting him like a cool wave, the scent of leather and new cars filling his lungs, the faint hum of classical music playing softly in the background. Inside, Ethan Bradley, 45, stood behind a polished counter, his crisp white shirt and tie a perfect match for the showroom's sterile elegance, his polished loafers reflecting the overhead lights. Ethan had been a salesman here for 2 decades, his slick smile and firm handshake closing deals with Dallas's elite, his client list a who's who of the city's wealthiest. But the riot had left him rattled, his nights filled with news reports of looting, his days marked by whispered conversations with colleagues about keeping an eye out, their voices low as they shared stories of chaos, their fear a palpable thing. Ethan had always carried a quiet bias, a belief that certain people didn't belong in places like this, but the riot had sharpened it, turned it into a lens through which he saw every unfamiliar face. When he saw Darius enter, casual, black, driving a rusting Toyota that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, his jaw tightened, a flicker of suspicion crossing his pale blue eyes, his hands smoothing his tie as if to steady himself. In Ethan's mind, Darius didn't belong here, not in a place where cars cost more than most people's homes, not after the chaos that had shaken the city, leaving broken glass and burned-out storefronts in its wake. He adjusted his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and approached, his voice smooth but laced with an edge, his posture stiff as he sized Darius up. "Hey there, welcome to Elite Motors," he said, his tone overly polite, his gaze raking over Darius's clothes, lingering on the faded t-shirt, the worn jeans, the scuffed sneakers. "You sure you're in the right place? We don't have any budget models here. I can point you to a dealership down the road, if you'd like. They've got some great used cars, might be more your speed." Darius blinked, the words hitting him like a slap, a sharp sting that cut through the excitement he'd felt walking in. He kept his smile, though it tightened at the edges, his voice light despite the irritation flaring in his chest, a spark that threatened to ignite. "I'm good, thanks," he said, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed despite the tension creeping into his shoulders, his dark eyes meeting Ethan's with a quiet defiance. "I'm here to see the Mclaren 720s. Saw it online, thought I'd check it out in person. I've got a thing for supercars, you know?" Ethan's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing, suspicion deepening as he glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Toyota parked crookedly in the lot. Its faded paint and dented bumper, a stark contrast to the gleaming supercars inside, their polished surfaces reflecting the showroom's lights like mirrors. "The Mclaren, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, his arms crossing over his chest, his tie shifting slightly as he leaned back, his stance a subtle barrier. "That's a $500,000 car, my friend. We don't usually let folks just check it out unless they're serious buyers. You got proof of funds on you? We've got to be careful these days, you know? After everything." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. A reference to the riot that had left Dallas on edge, a veiled accusation that made Darius's stomach churn, his hands clenching into fists inside his pockets. Though he kept his face calm, his smile a mask, Darius's heart beat faster, the spark of irritation flaring into anger, a heat that spread through his chest. But he kept his voice steady, his dark eyes locking onto Ethan's with a fire he couldn't quite hide. "I don't need to prove anything," he said, his tone firm but calm, his hands coming out of his pockets, palms up in a gesture of peace, though his fingers twitched with the effort to stay still. "I'm a customer, sane as anyone else here. I just want to see the car, nothing more, nothing less. You gonna show me, or do I need to talk to someone else?" Ethan's face hardened, the forced politeness slipping away like a mask, replaced by a cold edge that matched the tension in the air, his pale blue eyes narrowing further, his arms uncrossing as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. He felt a surge of unease, his mind flashing to the news reports, the broken windows, the chants of protesters that had filled the streets, their voices a roar that still echoed in his nightmares. In his eyes, Darius wasn't a customer. He was a potential threat, a man who didn't belong in this showroom. Not now, not after the chaos that had left the city raw and bleeding. "Look, buddy," Ethan said, his voice sharp, his finger jabbing the air as he loomed over Darius, his tie swinging slightly with the motion. "We don't mess around here. If you can't show me you're serious, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. We've had enough trouble around here lately. I'm not taking any chances with someone who looks like he can't even afford the tires on that car." Darius's breath caught, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected, a reminder of every time he'd been judged, dismissed, reduced to a stereotype because of his skin. A pain that ran deep, etched into his bones from years of navigating a world that too often saw him as less. He'd faced this kind of bias his whole life. Being followed in stores as a kid, his small hands empty but still suspect. Stopped by cops for looking suspicious while walking home from school. His backpack search for no reason other than his skin. Turned down for gigs because clients wanted someone who fit their brand better, a euphemism for not black. He'd learned to keep his head down, to smile through the sting, to prove his worth in a world that refused to see it. But this was different, sharper, the sting amplified by the raw tension still lingering in Dallas, the city's wounds fresh, its people on edge, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. He took a step back, hands raised, voice calm but firm, his dark eyes steady on Ethan's, a quiet defiance burning in their depths. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his words measured, his hands still raised, his sneakers scuffing the polished floor as he shifted his weight. "I just want to see the car. That's not a crime, is it? Or is there some other reason you don't want me here?" Ethan's face flushed, the implication hitting him like a jab. His suspicion morphing into defensiveness, his voice rising as he stepped closer, his finger jabbing the air, his tie swinging with the motion, his pale blue eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. "Don't play that card with me," he snapped, his tone sharp, his arms uncrossing as he loomed over Darius, his voice echoing in the showroom's sterile space. "I'm just doing my job. You don't look like you can afford a car like this, and after the riot, we can't take risks. If you're not going to cooperate, I'm calling security. Your choice." Darius's heart pounded, the anger in his chest burning hotter, a fire that threatened to consume him, but he kept his composure, his voice steady, though his eyes flashed with defiance, his hands still raised, his sneakers scuffing the floor as he shifted, the polished tiles cold beneath his feet. "I'm not leaving," he said, his tone firm, his gaze unyielding, his body tense with the effort to stay calm. "I have every right to be here, and you're not treating me like a customer. I want to speak to your manager, now." Ethan's face twisted, a mix of anger and fear flashing in his eyes, the fear of losing control, of being challenged by someone he'd already written off as a threat, a nobody who didn't belong in his showroom. He turned to a nearby security guard, a burly man in a black uniform, his radio crackling on his belt, and snapped, "Get him out of here. He's causing trouble. I don't trust him." Then lowering his voice, he added, "Call the cops too. After the riot, we can't take chances with people like him." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking to Darius, who stood with his hands still raised, his expression a mix of defiance and resignation. His sneakers scuffing the floor as he shifted, the polished tiles reflecting the showroom's lights. But Ethan's words carried the weight of authority, and the guard moved forward, his heavy boots thudding on the floor, his radio crackling as he called for backup, his hand reaching for Darius's arm. Darius's stomach dropped, a cold dread washing over him as he realized how quickly this was escalating, how a simple curiosity had turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. The showroom's sterile elegance now a prison closing in around him. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, his eyes darting between Ethan and the guard, his hands still raised, his sneakers scuffing the floor as he shifted, trying to keep his balance, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I just wanted to see the car." But the guard was already on him, grabbing his arm with a grip that made Darius wince, pulling him toward the exit as Ethan watched, arms crossed, a smug satisfaction settling over his features, his pale blue eyes glinting with a cold triumph. The showroom's other customers, mostly white, mostly wealthy, turned to stare, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. Their murmurs a low hum that filled the air, a mix of curiosity and judgment that made Darius's skin crawl. He didn't resist, knowing it would only make things worse, but his heart pounded, his mind racing with the injustice of it all, the humiliation burning like acid in his chest, a fire that threatened to consume him. The showroom doors burst open, and Officer Lauren Hayes, 38, strode in, her blue uniform crisp, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, her pale green eyes narrowing as they landed on Darius, her hand resting on her holster, her boots echoing on the polished floor. Hayes had been on edge since the riot, her nights filled with reports of violence, her days marked by calls from residents demanding protection from suspicious individuals, a phrase that too often meant black or brown faces in spaces deemed off-limits. When she saw Darius, black, casual, being restrained by a guard in a luxury showroom, her instincts kicked in, shaped by years of bias she'd never questioned, her training warped by the fear that had gripped Dallas since the riot. A fear that saw threats where there were none. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her gaze flicking to Ethan, her hand tightening on her holster, her posture tense with the readiness to act. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm now, his smugness replaced by a calculated concern, his arms uncrossing as he gestured at Darius, his tie shifting slightly with the motion. "This guy's causing trouble," he said, his tone smooth, his pale blue eyes glinting with a cold satisfaction. "He wouldn't leave when I asked, wouldn't show proof of funds. After the riot, we can't take chances. He might be up to something, maybe scoping the place out for trouble." Darius's eyes widened, his voice rising sharp with disbelief, his hands still raised, the guard's grip tightening on his arm, bruising his skin through his t-shirt. "That's a lie," he said, his tone cutting through the showroom's hum, his sneakers scuffing the floor as he shifted, trying to keep his balance, his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything but the injustice of the moment. "I'm a customer. I just wanted to see the Mclaren. He's been treating me like a criminal since I walked in, and now you're buying his story without even asking me. This isn't right." Hayes's jaw tightened, her hand moving to her cuffs, her voice cold, her pale green eyes narrowing with a mix of suspicion and impatience, her boots echoing on the floor as she stepped closer, her posture a warning in itself. "I don't have time for this," she said, her tone sharp, her hand snapping the cuffs off her belt with a metallic clink that echoed in the showroom, a sound that made Darius's stomach drop, a sound he'd heard in too many stories, seen in too many videos, a sound that carried the weight of centuries. "Turn around, hands behind your back, now." Darius's heart sank, a cold dread washing over him, his body tensing as he complied, knowing resistance would only make things worse. His sneakers scuffing the floor as he turned, his hands trembling as he placed them behind his back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cuffs snapped around his wrists, the steel biting into his skin, the sound a sharp, metallic snap that echoed in his ears, a sound that carried the weight of history, of every black man who'd been in this position before him, a sound that made his stomach churn with a mix of rage and helplessness. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, his eyes burning with defiance as Hayes pushed him toward the door, the guard stepping back, Ethan watching with a satisfied nod, his arms crossed, his pale blue eyes glinting with a cold triumph. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to see the car." The showroom's customers whispered, some filming, others turning away, their murmurs a low hum of judgment and curiosity, a sound that followed Darius as Hayes led him to her cruiser, his sneakers dragging on the pavement. His head high despite the humiliation burning in his chest, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Outside the crowd grew, drawn by the commotion, their phones raised, as Hayes pushed Darius into the cruiser, the door slamming shut with a finality that made his stomach drop, the sound a hollow echo that reverberated in his chest. Through the smudged window, he saw the Mclaren gleaming under the showroom lights, its sleek lines a mockery of the dream that had brought him here, a dream turned nightmare in the span of minutes, the city's tension a weight that pressed down on him, a weight he couldn't escape. At the precinct, Darius sat in a holding cell, his wrists raw from the cuffs, his dark eyes fixed on the concrete floor. His sneakers scuffing the ground as he shifted, trying to ease the ache in his shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow making his head throb, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat, disinfectant, and despair, a smell that clung to the walls like a memory. He'd been booked for disorderly conduct and trespassing, charges that felt like a betrayal, a twisted narrative that painted him as the villain for daring to exist in a space not meant for him, for daring to be black in a place where wealth and whiteness were the unspoken entry fee. His mind raced, replaying the scene, Ethan's sneer, Hayes's cold indifference, the cuffs snapping shut, the crowd's murmurs echoing in his ears. He'd faced bias before, a constant undercurrent in his life, but this was different, sharper. The sting amplified by the city's tension, the riot's aftermath a specter that haunted every interaction, a shadow that followed him even here in the cold gray cell. Darius had grown up in East Dallas, a neighborhood where the streets buzzed with life but also with the constant hum of survival, where he'd learned to navigate bias from a young age. He remembered being followed in stores as a kid, his small hands empty but still suspect, the clerk's eyes boring into him as he picked out candy for his little sister. He remembered being stopped by cops for looking suspicious while walking home from school, his backpack searched for no reason other than his skin, his heart pounding as he stood on the sidewalk, his classmates passing by, their whispers a weight on his shoulders. He remembered being turned down for gigs because clients wanted someone who fit their brand better, a euphemism for not black, a rejection that stung despite his talent, his resume a testament to his skill, but not to his worth in their eyes. He'd learned to keep his head down, to smile through the sting, to prove his worth in a world that refused to see it. But this was different, a public humiliation that cut deep, a wound that bled with every memory, every echo of the past. He pressed his forehead against the cool wall, hands trembling, mind on his father, Malcolm Mitchell, a billionaire tech mogul whose name carried weight, a titan whose empire had reshaped Dallas and beyond. Darius had kept his lineage hidden, wanting to live on his terms, to be seen for who he was, not what he came from, but now he wished he'd told someone, anyone, who he really was. He'd called Jamal Carter, a 28-year-old independent journalist and his friend. Before they took his phone, his voice low, urgent, his words rushed. "Get my dad," he'd whispered, his heart pounding, his breath hitching. "He needs to know. Tell him where I am." Outside the precinct, the crowd swelled, their voices rising in a chant that echoed through the humid night. A chorus of defiance that shook the air, a sound that carried the weight of a city's pain. "Free Darius, justice now." Jamal had been at the showroom to research a story on racial bias in luxury retail, his notebook filled with notes, his phone always ready to record. When he saw Darius in cuffs, his eyes had widened, his phone already filming, his voice rising as he pushed through the crowd, his sneakers pounding the pavement, his dreads swinging with the motion. "Hey, what's going on here?" he'd shouted, his tone sharp, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and disbelief. "He didn't do anything. He's a customer. Let him go." His video had spread online like wildfire, shared across social media with captions demanding justice, hashtags amplifying the outrage to a deafening roar. The city's wounds laid bare for the world to see. Animal rights activists, racial justice advocates, and local residents marched outside the precinct, their signs bobbing in the air, their voices a chorus of anger and hope. Darius deserves justice, and no more bias. News outlets picked up the story within hours, their headlines stark and unyielding. Black man handcuffed for viewing car in Dallas showroom, racial bias suspected. Reporters set up cameras across the street, their live feeds capturing the growing crowd, their voices a mix of anger and determination as they called for Darius's release, for accountability, for a city that could do better. Their chants a rhythm that pulsed through the night. Inside, Harper sat at his desk in the precinct's bullpen, scrolling through the video on his phone, his jaw tight, his pale face flushed with a mix of anger and unease, his fingers gripping the device so hard his knuckles whitened, the screen's glow reflecting in his pale green eyes. The comments were brutal, a relentless wave of condemnation that crashed over him, calling him a racist, a bully, demanding his badge be stripped, his career ended, his name dragged through the mud. His captain had already called, his voice icy through the phone, the words a knife in Harper's gut. "Fix this, Harper, or you're done. This is a PR nightmare, and I'm not going down for your mess." But Harper's mind was a tangle of justification and doubt, a storm he couldn't quiet, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He'd followed protocol, hadn't he? Darius was on private property, a reported troublemaker. His presence in Peachtree Heights a violation of the unspoken rules Harper had internalized over years on the force, rules that had been sharpened by the riot, by the fear that had gripped the city like a vice. Yet the security footage Jamal had presented, clear, unedited, damning, showed Darius as a calm customer, his hands raised, his voice steady, his only crime being black in a space deemed off-limits. The footage gnawed at Harper like a splinter under his skin. A truth he couldn't ignore, a truth that made his stomach churn with a mix of shame and defiance. Officer Maya Brooks, a black colleague with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for calling out bullshit, approached, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury, her uniform crisp despite the late hour, her hands on her hips as she stared him down, her voice a low, cutting whisper. "You screwed up, Lauren," she said, her words sharp, her tone unyielding. Her eyes locking onto Harper's with a fire that made her flinch. "You saw his skin and made a choice. You didn't listen, didn't ask, just acted. That's on you. You failed him, and you failed this city. You better hope that video doesn't end your career, because right now, it's looking real bad for you." Harper's face reddened, her voice defensive, her hands clenching into fists on the desk, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. A symbol of an authority she suddenly felt slipping through her fingers. "I was doing my job, Maya," she snapped, her tone sharp, her pale green eyes flashing with defiance, her blonde hair pulling tighter in its bun as she leaned forward, her voice rising. "He didn't belong there. He was causing trouble. I had a report. What was I supposed to do? Let him walk all over the place after what happened in this city?" Maya leaned in, her voice a whisper, sharp and unyielding. Her eyes locking onto Harper's with a fire that made her flinch, her hands on her hips, her stance unyielding. "Your job isn't to assume, Lauren," she said, her words a blade that cut through Harper's excuses, her tone a mix of anger and disappointment. "Your job is to protect, to serve, not to judge. You failed him, and you failed this city. You better hope you can fix this, because right now you're on the wrong side of history." At the showroom, Ethan stood behind the counter, his hands trembling slightly, his tie askew, his pale blue eyes darting to the windows where the crowd of protesters had gathered, their chants a low roar that seeped through the glass, a sound that made his stomach churn with a mix of fear and defiance. The smug satisfaction he'd felt, watching Darius being led away, had faded, replaced by a growing unease, a sense that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, that the city's tension had led him to a mistake he couldn't undo. The showroom's other employees whispered behind their desks, their eyes flicking to Ethan, their voices low, a mix of judgment and fear as they watched the protesters grow, their signs a sea of demands for justice, their chants a rhythm that pulsed through the evening air. Ethan's phone buzzed with notifications, news alerts, social media posts, all echoing the same story, the same outrage, the same demand for accountability, a wave that threatened to drown him, a wave he couldn't outrun. The showroom doors burst open, and Malcolm Mitchell entered, a towering figure in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair gleaming under the showroom's lights, his presence commanding, a force that sucked the air from the room, leaving it silent in his wake. Malcolm was 60, a billionaire tech mogul, whose name graced skyscrapers and headlines, a titan of industry whose empire had reshaped Dallas and beyond, a man whose wealth and influence made him a legend, a black man who'd risen from nothing to everything, a symbol of what was possible in a world that too often said it wasn't. His dark eyes burned with a quiet fury, his jaw set, his polished loafers echoing on the polished floor as he strode forward, his suit jacket shifting slightly with each step, his cufflinks glinting with the weight of his authority. The room fell silent, Ethan's face paling, his hands dropping to his sides, his tie suddenly feeling like a noose as Malcolm's voice boomed, filling the space with a power that made the walls tremble, a voice that carried the weight of a father's love and a city's pain. "That's my son you've got in cuffs," he said, his tone low, controlled, but laced with a fury that made Ethan take a step back, his pale blue eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. "My son, who you treated like a criminal for daring to look at a car, for daring to exist in a space you decided he didn't belong in." Malcolm's words hung in the air, a thunderclap that reverberated through the showroom, the crowd outside falling silent, their chants pausing as they watched through the windows, their phones raised to capture the moment, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and anticipation. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to find words, any words, to defend himself, but nothing came, his mind a blank slate of fear and shame. Malcolm stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto Ethan's, his voice a low growl, his words a blade that cut through the salesman's excuses. "You judged him by his skin, not his worth," he said, his tone unyielding, his hands steady at his sides, his cufflinks glinting with the weight of his authority. "You saw a black man in a t-shirt and a beat-up car, and you decided he was a threat, a thief, someone who didn't belong. You didn't ask, didn't listen, just acted. And now my son is in cuffs because of you. Because of your bias, your fear. This isn't just about him. It's about every black person who's been wronged like this, who's been judged, dismissed, humiliated for daring to exist. This stops now." Malcolm turned to the cameras, his voice steady, his words a clarion call that echoed through the showroom, through the crowd, through the city, a call for justice that reverberated in the hearts of all who heard it. "I'm Malcolm Mitchell," he said, his tone firm, his dark eyes blazing with a fire that could not be extinguished, his suit jacket shifting slightly as he stood taller, his presence a beacon of hope and rage. "And I won't let this stand. My son will be released, now, and I'll make sure this showroom, this city, learns what justice means. I'll sue for discrimination, and I'll make sure every person who's ever been treated like this gets their voice heard. We're done being silent." The crowd erupted, their chants rising like a wave, a roar of defiance and hope that shook the air, their signs bobbing higher, their voices a chorus of support. "Justice for Darius, justice now." Ethan's face drained of color, his hands trembling, his tie askew, his pale blue eyes darting to the windows, to the crowd, to the cameras. A man caught in the storm of his own making, a storm he couldn't outrun. The showroom's other employees froze, their whispers silenced, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe, their hands clutching their phones as they recorded the moment, a moment that would change everything. Darius was released within the hour. The charges dropped, the precinct's doors opening to a wave of cheers from the crowd outside, their voices rising like a tide, a chorus of support that wrapped around him like a shield, a sound that filled his chest with a mix of relief and rage. He stepped out, his wrists raw, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, his faded t-shirt clinging to his sweat-dampened skin, his dark eyes blazing with a quiet defiance, his head high despite the humiliation that still burned in his chest. Malcolm was at his side, his tailored suit a stark contrast to Darius's casual clothes, his silver hair gleaming in the streetlights, his dark eyes softening as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of love and strength that grounded Darius in the chaos, a reminder of who he was, of the legacy he carried, a legacy of resilience and fight. Ethan was fired the next day, the showroom's management bowing to public pressure, their statement a hollow apology that did little to quell the outrage, their reputation tarnished by the viral video, by the chants that still echoed outside their doors. He was forced into a bias training program, a requirement he resented but couldn't avoid. His pride a bitter pill he swallowed with every session, his career a casualty of his own actions. The sessions were grueling, held in a community center basement, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and regret, the room filled with civilians and ex-cops, their eyes hard as they shared stories of bias and harm, their voices a chorus of pain and accountability. In one session, Ethan broke down, his voice shaking, his pale face streaked with tears, his hands trembling as he spoke, the weight of his actions crashing over him like a wave. A truth he couldn't escape. "I saw him as a threat," he admitted, his words halting, raw, his pale blue eyes staring at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the facilitator, a black woman with a steady presence, her voice firm but not unkind. Not a person, just a threat. I didn't know I was carrying that. I didn't know it was in me. The facilitator nodded, her gaze steady, her words a challenge and a promise. Knowing's the first step, she said, her tone unyielding. But it doesn't undo the harm you caused. You've got work to do, hard work, and it starts with facing the truth. Ethan left each session a little more broken, his life a tangle of regret and slow, painful growth, his career a relic of a past he could never reclaim, a lesson he'd learned too late. Hayes was suspended, her badge confiscated, her career on the line, the precinct's walls closing in around her like a cage. She was forced into a retraining program, a requirement she resented but couldn't avoid. Her pride a bitter pill she swallowed with every session, her nights filled with the echo of Maya's words, a truth she couldn't escape. The program was grueling, held in a community center basement, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and regret. The room filled with civilians and ex-cops, their eyes hard as they shared stories of bias and harm, their voices a chorus of pain and accountability. In one session, Hayes broke down, her voice shaking, her pale face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she spoke, the weight of her actions crashing over her like a wave, a truth she couldn't escape. I saw him as a threat, she admitted, her words halting, raw, her pale green eyes staring at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the facilitator. A black man with a steady presence, his voice firm but not unkind. Not a person, just a threat. I didn't know I was carrying that. I didn't know it was in me. The facilitator nodded, his gaze steady, his words a challenge and a promise. Knowing's the first step, he said, his tone unyielding, but it doesn't undo the harm you caused. You've got work to do, hard work, and it starts with facing the truth. Hayes left each session a little more broken, her life a tangle of regret and slow, painful growth, her career a relic of a past she could never reclaim, a lesson she'd learned too late. She wrote a public apology to Darius, her words a small step toward redemption, a promise to do better, a promise she'd spend the rest of her career trying to keep. The incident sparked dialogues across Dallas, bridging divides between races and classes in Peachtree Heights. Darius bought a Mclaren 720s from another dealership, a quiet victory, a symbol of his worth, of his right to dream, to exist, to be seen. He drove through East Dallas, the engine purring beneath him, his head high, his dark eyes reflecting the city's lights, a man unbroken by the world's weight, a man who turned his pain into power, his father's legacy a shield and a sword. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for Dallas, not for the countless others whose stories hadn't yet been told, the names that filled the news, the faces that haunted his dreams. But Darius knew, as he drove through the streets, the city's heartbeat thrumming beneath his wheels, that every act of defiance, every stand against injustice, was a step toward a better world, a world where worth wasn't judged by skin, where a black man could dream without fear, a world he'd fight for with every breath he had.